Good morning, everyone. My name is Archana Verma, and I'm the Marketing Director at United Way of King County, and I use she, her pronouns. We are ready to get started. Firstly, thank you so much for these amazing comments in this chat. We're looking forward for an interactive conversation today. So this is our Conversations for Change event hosted by United Way of King County. And at United Way, we begin all our events with an acknowledgement of the land we're on. While this is a virtual event, the United Way of King County office is in downtown Seattle on Coast Salish land. Please take a moment to read our land acknowledgement statement and reflect on your relationship with the land you're on and its people. And with that, election fever is around us. And if you're like me, you're probably also inundated with information, analysis, and more everywhere we go. But what's real and what's fake? And how do you tell? And who can you trust with election reporting? Over the next hour, we'll have the opportunity to hear from someone who can offer us behind the scenes insights from the newsroom, help us connect the dots on how misinformation and media bias disproportionately affect marginalized communities, and help us take away practical tips to confidently navigate election related media. Julie Wolfe, news director at King 5, and in conversation with United Way of King County CEO and President Gordon McHenry Jr. This is the third event in our series on voting and civic engagement. We had a Get Out the Vote speaker panel in September and a civic engagement event at the Gates Foundation earlier this month. For today's event, we're excited to have an interactive conversation. So instead of presenting our speakers with a list of pre-populated questions, we're looking to you to help us shape the discussion based on what you're curious about. So please use the chat for your comments on the program as we have this conversation. And please use the Q&A in our Zoom webinar to post questions that you have for Gordon and Julie throughout the program. And we'll do our best to infuse them into the program. And with that, now it's time to welcome our speakers, Julie and Gordon. Take it away.
Well, I think I get to go first. I'm Gordon McHenry Jr., President and CEO of United Way of King County. Really excited to be with Julie Wolfe, the King 5 News Director and a member of our United Way of King County Board. Especially excited that we have, I think I saw like 90 folks who are currently participating in this webinar. As Archana indicated, we want this to be a conversation, so we'll be encouraging you to submit your questions. Comments in the Q&A, comments in the comments, and then questions in the Q&A. We do have some questions already that we're going to start with. But first, I want to make sure people understand who we are. At United Way, we're working side by side with communities to build an equitable future for everyone. For us, that means including and ensuring everyone has access to resources, enough to eat, quality education, and a safe place to call home. Safe place to call home is one of the reasons why we're having this conversation. We are in a democracy. We rely upon and benefit from news. It guides our actions. And many of us are having some challenges understanding, what news is factual, what news is actually opinions. How do we navigate this? And so I'm really hoping that Julie will help us with that. At United Way, we know that we provide and work in basic needs, but we also work really hard to change systems and policies that tend to hold our community back, our members of our community back. And so for us, advocacy, action to change policy is really important. We are, of course, a 501c3 nonprofit, so we are nonpartisan when it comes to elections that are partisan, but we're very active in issues of policy. And so we think today was a great opportunity to lean in to this area of concern. So I want to start by making sure folks get to know Julie as I've gotten to know her, and ask her to share a little bit about her background, how she got into this career path, and just what does it mean to be a news director? Julie.
Thank you, Gordon. When you asked me to talk about this, I thought back, and I'm one of those rare people, I think, that I'm doing something I kind of always wanted to do. From a very young age, I think I believed in the power of written word. I read the paper all the time, the Chicago Tribune growing up. I wrote a lot, so I wanted to be a writer. And then when I was 14 years old, if you ever go to the CNN Center in Atlanta, you can do a tour, and there's a little part of it where you can pay. At the time, it was a VHS, $14.99 for a VHS. You could sit at the table and at the desk, and they had a CNN jacket, and you could read from the teleprompter. And that was kind of like, I never looked back. To answer your question, what is it like? The journalism historically has meant a lot of moves and a lot of places. So, I've lived all over the country. Most recently, 3 states in 6 years, and Seattle's home for me now. I'm thrilled to be here, and I've been here 3.5 years. And so as the news director, that is a role that I kind of oversee all of the newsroom. So I will oversee kind of editorial strategic kind of vision, and then day-to-day editorial kind of conversations, hiring, talent coaching, all of those things kind of fall under the news director.
So when I'm no longer president and CEO of United Way of King County, I can apply for a job working for you and King
I'm
5,
sure
sounds
you'd be
like.
great, Gordon.
Well, let's see how well I do today interviewing you. Let's start off by fundamentally, in your opinion, what is the role of media in responsibly covering elections? And operative word is responsible.
I'm really glad that you said that, Gordon, because I do think as we go through this conversation today, I looked at some of the chats. I think, you know, um, we have to acknowledge, some of the mistakes people have made in the past, and maybe even when you talk about the representation of BIPOC communities, some of the harm that maybe mainstream media has done in the past. We acknowledge that, and I think we fought really hard to move forward and to make sure that we're really representing our community. And I think that the data shows, so this isn't just my opinion because I love journalism and I always will, but the data shows that in news deserts, so news deserts are places that have no newspaper and not covered by local news, that the civic turnout and civic engagement is lower, that voter turnout is lower, and that corruption is higher. Some of the worst corruption is these really small towns because there aren't people to hold them to account. So I really think even our role has changed a little bit. Traditionally, I think the role of elections was to kind of introduce you to a candidate. How do they feel about this or that? Maybe hold debates to see how they answer those sorts of questions, to make sure the viewers' questions and concerns are put to a candidate. And I think that's still part of our job, but I think it is vital, especially now, to be as transparent as possible about the systems. What is this? How does it work? We've been doing mail-in ballot here forever here in the state of Washington, but there's still people new to the state, and there's still a lot of conversations about that, and really helping people understand how the process works. If you hear like ballot harvesting, what does that mean? And is it legal? And how does that work? And really making sure that we're trying to help people feel confident in the process and also hold it to account. We ask a lot of tough questions and look into these, voting irregularities, if you will. And I think that's also part of our job to investigate those and to report back to the public about whether those are true or not. And I think that's really important. It's a really important role because if people don't feel confident that the system works, they won't participate in it. So I think that's a little bit of a new role, to be honest. I don't know that that's necessarily something we might have felt like we needed 20 years ago, but I do think that's a really important part going into this election, especially.
I appreciate that. I do want us to talk a bit about media and its ability to help restore trust or maintain trust in elections and that aspect of government. But before there, I really is fascinating to hear you talk about communities where there's a media desert and there's a correlation between lower civic engagement. It sometimes feels to many of us that we actually have an overload of information coming to us that is characterized as news. And when we talked earlier, I laughed because I remember back in the day, you had like 3 dominant TV stations and you had a PBS station. News went off the air late at night, and now you've got cable news. You have the internet, you have Instagram. So there seems like there's a proliferation or lots of and we have international news that comes from other geographic locations. And so it feels like the media landscape has changed a lot in the last few decades. So how are people able to identify reliable information sources during elections, during a critical time like elections, especially when there's so much disinformation in its peak? Are there tools or strategies you'd like to suggest to our audience?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a few main things. I'm glad you talked about the media landscape. Think of it like a buffet. Has a lot on there, but just like a buffet, some of it's junk and some of it's good, right? And when you go to a buffet, you don't take one of everything, right? You discern and think like, this is what I want and this is what I don't want. And this looks good and this does not look good. And I think we have to be informed voters about what we consume and what we pass on. I think Jim said it in the chat, and I really appreciate that question. How can we join together to fight misinformation? And I love that question because it also implies like each of us play a role, not just King. And so I think, to me, a couple of things. First, just pause. I think part of the problem with misinformation is that we just don't pause for a minute. It's like share, 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 share. Like, let's pause and think like, let's think about that for a minute. Like, is that accurate? Is that correct? And I think to be able to answer that question, we can't be source agnostic. We have to think, where is this coming from? And is that source a trusted source? And I acknowledge that people's trusted sources might be different, but I think knowing where things are coming from is so key. And some of the misinformation comes from places you might think is a journalism entity and it's not. So I would say, if it's not coming from a source that you clearly recognize, a King 5, an NBC News, a Seattle Times, Google it and it'll be very quickly clear if that is a legitimate news source or not, because there's lots of reporting even on that. And I think that's really important. So pause, check on your sources, and then, look at a body of work, right? Not just necessarily one, I see this one article, what does that mean? But really thinking of, has this is a newspaper or journalism or an agency that has, has a body of work that has published truthful information for a long time. I think that's really important. Going again to what Jim said, like, what is your role? I would also urge you to take responsibility. I think that's something that, this is not something that I can solve individually. This is not something that Gordon can solve individually. We, collective as a community, need to stop sharing misinformation, and then people will stop getting it. And I know that's a wish and a hope, that we could do that. But I think what I've seen sometimes within my own family, or certainly within my own feed, I'm like, when I see it, I'm like, that's not true. Why would you share that? And they're like, well, whatever. And I think and I know we're going to talk about this more, Gordon, but there are very clear case studies where misinformation and disinformation have caused real harm individually to communities. And so I think that I don't think we can take this, any more seriously. I think, think of your reshare, your reclick, your like, that is a power vote. And if you are voting something, it's almost like saying this is true, right? Because you never know. Maybe they might see you post something and think, hey, I know Gordon, he's a legit guy. And if he's posting this, it must be true. They might not even go back and look. So you might not realize what you are endorsing with your name and reputation. And so I think that's that part, just like pause, think, and if you don't know, maybe don't share it until you know more. That would kind of be my suggestion.
It's interesting. Thank you for that. And it's interesting because, two things that from my perspective, a couple of weeks ago, I heard some news and I shook my head, said, this can't be accurate. This has got to be misinformation, disinformation. But then I said, my wife and I, we know some people, very close friends who live in Ohio. So I said, here's what's been reported. But what is your perception? What is your reality? And it started a very interesting conversation, which validated my instinct that that was false news and it was actually inflammatory. And they later kept in contact and said, here's some things that are happening in this town in Ohio where we live, and it's harming people. And so I wasn't going to spread that fake news, but I was sort of curious, could this be accurate? And so I took the time to ask. The other thing that I do lately now is when I have some pronouncement in like my family and friends, I will say, I heard on CNN, I heard on BBC, I read some, and then most importantly, Instagram just told me this. What do you all think about that? And because, and it makes for an interesting conversation, I think, when you provide a little context on what your source is, because then somebody else can also understand, yeah, maybe it's not fact, it's opinion, maybe it's not accurate totally. So I really appreciate you encouraging us to be active and be thoughtful before we repost or perhaps react or take action because of something that has come to us. There is in the chat or in the Q&A, sorry, we talked about um, uh, working together but also there's this idea of, algorithms and also AI. And so to me, not surprised by the concept of algorithm to help keep us interested or to trap us. But what about AI? What are you at King 5 to the extent you can talk about that, or are you concerned about AI as a amplifying and increasing confusion, misinformation, disinformation?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways that we should be aware that we are being used. So first of all, if you use social media, what they are selling is your information. Like, we know that, right? I hope everybody knows that. If you don't know that, shock, you are selling your personal information. That is what they get off of you, right? And so part of what, the algorithms are built around is keeping you on the platform as long as possible. We've seen that in some recent lawsuits against some of the platforms. Several years ago, one of the best examples I can think about this is YouTube. And it was a specific study looking into extremism and extreme violence specifically. And because the problem is, if you watch a show, you watch something on YouTube, great, you will like this. If you like that, you'll like this. If you like this, and it goes on and on for infinity, right? It never stops. If you like this. So the problem with that is, if you watch one video, they will feed you video after video after video after video of the same thing. And it creates this echo chamber. So one of the things YouTube did was they kind of also built into their algorithm, like, oh, you should also consider this, right? So if you're looking at a particular opinion, this, yes, they will feed you that, but they will also put some things in the algorithm that are balanced. And I think that YouTube is one of the social media companies that is still doing this well. Some of the others, I think we've actually stepped back a little bit. If you think about the role of just trying to make sure that the information was legitimate that was on those platforms, that's really rolled back since everything that happened with COVID. So I think that it's important for you to know that you are kind of being manipulated and to understand. Maybe stop a minute if you are watching again and again and again. Maybe like forcefully make yourself consider what are the other viewpoints. So I expect kind of the AI on top of those algorithms to increase that. The other thing about AI, though, I think is so vital, particularly about disinformation. And we could talk about kind of the difference between misinformation and disinformation later if you want to, but particularly with disinformation, the tools for AI are incredible. Particularly manipulating video and imagery. Now, this is stuff that like an artist has been doing, right? We've seen movies. Some of the people that are on here are great Photoshop experts. The difference is the tools now make it very easy to manipulate an image just in a couple of clicks and for it to look pretty believable. And so there's been a couple of case studies. One example, there was a principal, his voice was manipulated, and it had that principal saying some terrible things in New York. I mean, horrific things. The school, there was violence in the school. People reacted. It wasn't him. It was a group of students who used an AI to copy his voice and say things he did not say. Audio AI is some of the easiest AI to fake. So that concerns me a lot. So at King, we've all gone through AI training to look for things. We call them remnants. Those are kind of signs that an image or a video has been manipulated. If you kind of zoom in, you can usually see around edges, things like fabric. Doesn't usually look good. AI is still not great at hands. It's not great at wrinkles. It's not great at some of those things, but it's getting better and better. It's not great at words. So I would say that concerns me a lot because I think it's so hard to tell. So I do think, and by the way, we already went into AI, people showing video and saying, I didn't say that, even when we already had video of them, right? So that's the other side of it, Gordon, that is not about AI, but I worry that it could also be like an easy blame. Like if somebody is caught on video where we show something and they could say like, that's not me, that's AI. I didn't say that. And proving that it's true is going to be really interesting and I think really hard. And so I think that's something we just need to continue to be cautious with and make sure that we're asking the right questions. Just like I said, where did this come from? When you look at sources, for us, it's like, where did this come from? How did they get this video? Was it in public in a bunch of places? Was it, were there other people in the room? What did this look like? And being extra cautious. And I think that's, again, just that pausing and thinking like, how do we know this is real? And I think we're going to have to keep answering those questions. All of that being said, AI is here to stay. I think all of us in our jobs know that. It's going to be doing work within our jobs, busy work or other work that we're going to happen. And so that's not going to get better. It's going to get harder and harder to differentiate reality from manipulated images. So that's, again, why I think your sources are really smart, right? If I send a reporter out to do a story, I've got a reporter in Tacoma today working on a story. The images are true, right? She's out there on the ground. People know she's there. I know she's there. Those images are absolutely true. If someone from the community sends me a video, I don't know for sure that's true. And I'm going to have to check it. I'm going to have to check the metadata, check for things, walk somebody through that. And I think that that's another reason why you have to be cautious about your sources.
I appreciate that. So AI is here to stay. It's been with us for a while. It's getting more present in our lives. We also have the reality of echo chambers, filter bubbles. Yeah. So we have this important local, regional, state, and national elections, and we have this reality of echo chambers and filter bubbles, and that we hope people are wanting to make decisions that really impact, at least at United Way, impact policy, impact people's lives in a way that helps them and brings them along. But we also have data that says red states are getting redder, blue states are getting bluer. So, and algorithms may be contributing to that. Politicians politicizing issues may contribute to that. So, how do people break through these kind of barriers to a more objective reality, one where there's more curiosity and more critical thinking? And yet we are perhaps still feeling the effects of COVID when we were so isolated, and people aren't maybe as active in the community. In fact, one of the persons in the chat said they're concerned because they're not yet out in the community and they can't leave their house for certain reasons. And so, how do we deal with isolation and echo chambers and filters?
I think that is so important. I don't know about you guys, but I do miss the days when we had a lot of conversations with people I disagreed with, right? We talked and we argued and we battled and we debated. And maybe I would come away from those conversations changing my mind. Maybe I wouldn't, but I feel like I would always come away, if not agreeing, I understood where they were coming from. And maybe sometimes it might reinforce my own beliefs, right? But I think like those conversations, whether they are in person, whether they're virtual, whether they are on social media, are so important, Gordon, because I think just like we know how important it is to have a diverse network, to have a diverse group of friends, we know that to like actually represent the community you're in and to understand the problems, the solutions of people, you've got to be out in the community, right? And so I really think that that we have to do that. I think that's the first way. I would love to challenge everybody on this call to, between now and election day, have an in-person conversation with someone you know disagrees with you. I would love that. And not to like escalate to a fight, but to just say like, we can disagree and have a civil conversation. I hope those will become more common one day and those will return. And I think they aren't. And I think that's at the center of it. It is a very much like a team, like you're on this team, you're on this team, or I'm on this team, and it doesn't matter. I'm not going to listen. And I might even make assumptions about you because you're on the other team. And I think we've got to get away from that. So I think one of the things is maybe to like look around and have a real moment with yourself about like, am I in an echo chamber? And we talk about this a lot in the newsroom, by the way, because just by the nature of being in a media company, some of our life experiences are similar. Most people in the newsroom have gone to college, not all of them. And so I think we've really worked hard to change even some of our hiring policies and some of how we recruit to make sure that our lived experiences more mirror and echo the community. But I think you have to have a real moment to think like, is this a diverse group? Is this representative of the information that's out there? So I think, making sure that you're getting information from a variety of sources is a good thing to do. If you're consuming from a really, right-wing organization, go ahead and listen to a few things that are admittedly left-wing, right? Because I think that that's important to make sure you're getting those things. If you are, maybe you feel like you've got some really good legitimate sources, you can fact check them by fact checking each other. And I think that's really, really important too. And I do think, you talked, Gordon, kind of about that siloing, and I think loneliness kind of is America's new epidemic since COVID. And I do really feel like that is part of this discussion. It might feel like a really different discussion, but I do feel like that's part of it, because some of those places where you do get to talk to people, Gordon, you said like, hey guys, I saw this on Instagram. Is it right? You have family to say that to, right? But there's so many people that I do think are alone that don't have that. And so they do turn to social media and some of these really insular groups that are maybe they're private groups, and they're all there because their groups are often made around a particular ideology. And that ideology might not have to do anything with the other things, but it kind of starts to create a really similar group, and it can become an echo chamber really quickly. So I think it's up to all of us to kind of work really hard to break out of those. But I think those are very hard.
I will share with the audience, I shared it with Julie before, that we're United Way of King County, so we operate and serve all of King County, urban, suburban, rural. If people turn out to be conservative or progressive or liberal, we serve those who are in need. So I do agree with you. We have to break out of the echo chambers. We have to find the courage and resilience to engage in conversation with people who think differently. And so I practiced that a few months ago. I didn't realize it was going to be such a long conversation, but it was a flight from Seattle to Miami, where my wife cleverly had me in the middle seat. She was in the aisle. And then the person in the window seat had opinions and beliefs and assumptions that were radically different than mine. And we managed to have a tough but civil conversation. But at some point, I was so glad that I had a book and I had an iPad and I had headphones, and I was able to stop the conversation because it was a 5-hour flight. And I have good endurance, but I wasn't going to be able to hang in there for 5 hours. But so for those of you out there, do practice what Julie is talking about. Do try to find ways to talk with people, engage with people in a civil discourse, and then who have different beliefs and assumptions and perceptions.
Corey,
Julie,
can I just add one thing? I saw something in the chat, and I think it goes with what you were saying before we move on. How, if you are talking with someone who believes deeply in some misinformation, how do you talk to them? And I think that's a great question. Gordon, you were lucky that you got to get off the plane, because some of us live with people, maybe in our families or our friends, and there's no plane to get off of, right? And I think that can be extraordinarily challenging. And I think some relationships have been severed over the last few years because of that. But I think research has shown the best thing you can do going into those conversations is to try to not go in with a shaming kind of attitude, right? This is dumb, this is stupid, how do you believe that? Boom, shut down. I'm not going to believe anything you say. But instead, just to tell me a little bit more about why you think that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Like, where did you find this? Did you ever think about this? Or that doesn't really align with what I know to be true. Does it align with what you know to be true? And how sure are you of this? And do you feel confident to take action in this information? And research has shown that, so I would encourage, and that's kind of hard sometimes, especially if it's way out there. I mean, some of it is way out there, but to try to go in, just try to share facts, shared facts. I thought somebody said a shared reality. So data can be your friend, especially data from really believable sources, things like the CDC or, the government sources, those sorts of things. Usually. And so I think that's the way to do it. That's what I would encourage you to do, is go in with a sense of curiosity instead of judgment, which is good advice for all of us in life, right?
Absolutely. And I think some people in the chat have said that, go into those conversations with curiosity, open-mindedness, and I statements and clarifying questions. I want to go back a little bit earlier, because one of the questions in the from the audience, I think is directly relevant to something you talked about in terms of diversity. So I'm just going to read this one because it's a little bit long. Credibility being the coin of your realm, King 5 News, and operate on the premise that people don't tend to believe or engage with media in which they don't see themselves. How well do you believe King 5 reflects the racial, class, economic diversity of not only your current audience, but the audience you would like to have? What steps is King 5 taking to ensure preserve that broad definition of diversity? And you mentioned about the that diversity is something you want to have inside the walls of King 5. How would you address this question?
I really appreciate the question. And Gordon, you said want to have. I think it's must have. It is core to our relevance and our survivability. And so what I have learned is that if you are going to put a policy or belief in place, it has to have a system of accountability and it has to have money and time behind it. So for us at King, we've done that. And I think, again, historically, media hasn't represented communities well, not just within the newsroom, but like how we're covering. And you're absolutely right. I've heard somebody say, if it doesn't look like me, it's not for me. And I think that is absolutely a legitimate thing to say. So one of the things we do, our goal is to always, from a racial diversity standpoint, to equal or surpass our community. You know, if there's 33% minority in the city of Seattle, or I'm sorry, in our viewing area, that is our goal within the newsroom. We are past that goal at King 5, both behind and in front of the camera. And we continually work to do that. But we also have a really active BIPOC advisory committee, and they helped us do that. They helped us, I already mentioned, like rethink some of our hiring policies, rethink some of our retention policies, rethinking some of how we cover that. And then what we do is we have an outside auditing group that audits our content. They usually do it 4 times a year, and they just like you watch, they don't watch everything. They pick a couple, pick a few newscasts, pick a couple websites, and there's a variety of measurements. It includes like on FaceTime, and that includes our talent, but the people we interview. Is it a negative story? Is it a positive story? And then we kind of have these metrics, like, are we growing in the right direction? And if not, why not? And I think that is really vital, because saying you want to do something and then holding yourself accountable no matter what happens, I think is really, really vital. So I think there's still work to be done. 100% will continue to be done. And I hope that, as people are looking for those local sources, and whether it's on streaming or .com, that they will definitely see themselves. And I do want to share one thing that was uncovered in that, because I think it was super important, and I didn't see it, and then I couldn't unsee it. So one of the things that was uncovered in that audit was images used on the website. And like back, it was kind of still COVID was going on. And so a hand holding a shot, or it was always a white male hand, right? A doctor, like white male hand, always. And I never noticed, because it's like a stock image, it never occurred to me. And then I couldn't not see it. And once people, within our newsroom said, like, why is it always a white dude? Then I was like, yeah, everybody can be doctors. But when we started going into the systems that, Getty Images is kind of sometimes where you get still photos, the algorithms put the things at the top that people most use. So it's like this vicious feeding cycle. So we had to make a concerted effort to go find diverse stock images, and hopefully we said over time, we will change the algorithm, like we will make the system better. But it was like almost like we had to break that cycle, but we couldn't break it unless we acknowledged it existed, and we didn't even know until we knew. And I think having someone in the newsroom who says, like, that hand doesn't look like my hand, and I think that's really, really important. And that goes back to the start of the question of why having a diverse newsroom is really important. And in that part that I was talking about, I was kind of focused on racial diversity, because I think that's what the question was. But I think those are other parts of diversity that are equally as important. Socioeconomic diversity, age diversity, gender diversity, all of those things I think are really, really important. Again, because you can't serve a community that you don't understand.
Exactly. And I think that sounds like also that there's an opportunity when you're a local or regional news source like King 5 is, to be very attentive to the existing diversity of the community in which your people are receiving the news. And then, King 5 is part of, NBC. So when you have that kind of epiphany, like, my goodness, we're tending to show, a monolithic approach to who can be a doctor, who is a doctor. Does that get amplified or shared across the network of NBC news outlets? I mean, do people actually talk about that and say, hey, folks, other news directors, we just recognize we're falling into a trap, encouraging you to step out of that also? I mean, do you guys share that kind of learnings across the network?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways to, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but like we are an NBC affiliate, but we're not owned and operated by NBC. There's a media company called Tegna. They own 50 television stations in different markets. So from a company perspective, absolutely, regularly and consistently, news directors and other leaders are talking about these things and pushing. And then, how was your audit and how did you move it? And what are maybe you had this problem last year and I saw that you had a lot of progress in that space. How did you do that? So definitely within the company. And then I also think more within the industry, there are different associations and organizations, and I have seen a lot of effort and work that has gone into doing better over the past, 5 to 10 years. Again, I think there's still more work to do. And candidly, I worry that some of that work has slid back. That's why, again, like putting a system and money into something ensures that it will continue. We kind of institutionalized our Facing Race team for the same reason. Before it was just a temporary assignment, we made it a permanent unit so it couldn't go away. And I think that is what you need to see happening. And so I think you do, but I do think we could do a better job, Gordon, because here's the thing though, to share that you have to have the humility and acknowledgement you're doing something wrong, and not everyone is in the space to do that. And so that's where it gets a little challenging. I might tell you like, hey, we saw this, you should consider this. And they might think like, we're fine, whatever. And so I think monolithically in the industry, there is a variety of acceptance of kind of those best practices and how to adopt them for their own stations.
Great. I saw it was a question, it was in the chat, but I think it may be moving over to the Q&A, but it was one basically, how often does a news outlet, let's say King 5, Speak for King 5, bring on politicians of differing political perspectives or doctrine? Do you intentionally try to present to us politicians who have very different viewpoints?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Gordon. And it's really important for us to have that balance. We talk a lot about it. We hosted a gubernatorial debate, and we had to work months and months to get those two men on to do a debate. And I thought that was a great example. And most importantly, we all agreed, including their representatives, that we wanted it to be a civil debate. And for the most part, it was, and informative, right? We didn't want this to be a yelling. We wanted to inform voters. So one of the things that we do often do, sometimes it's hard to fact check live. So a lot of times putting something to tape is and making sure there's context around it, I think is important. But I think so yes, I think we really try to do it. I do have this isn't exactly politicians, but I think it's important. As you might all remember, this was quite some time ago, we knew Roe v. Wade was going to be reversed. Remember that the page had leaked from the Supreme Court. So we knew that was coming, right? So as we prepared for that coverage, we talked about making sure that we really made a concerted effort to be objective and unbiased in our coverage. And, in some way, and so that morning when we were looking for reaction, we said it was really important to make sure we got someone who supported this move and approved this move. And I would really like it to be a woman and maybe not an evangelical white man, just because that's kind of a stereotypical, stance. And so, we worked hard to find representation. And sometimes that's really hard, Gordon. Politicians usually, because they like to talk. But when you're looking for real people, sometimes, people don't want to put themselves out there. Sometimes one side will be really loud and the other side might be like, really have a differing opinion. Sometimes you're like, why didn't you ask somebody else? And I think the challenge is not everybody is willing to put themselves out there. And so I think that's where our job comes in, to really try to create that balance. And if you can't get the person there, try to represent them by the kinds of questions and kind of fact checking the other person going along. But I will absolutely say to that question, it is a concerted effort in everything we do, from the moment that we start our editorial meeting to script approval to the time that it airs. Is this balanced? Like, did we talk to this person? What's the other side of this? I always like to say, like, who's going to be mad when they see this story, and have we talked to them, right? I think that's a good way to think about who is going to disagree with this, and did we call them and at least give them the chance to respond to the story.
Appreciate that. For those who receive media from a variety of sources, it does influence their world outlook, their outlook on the world. And so we have a question, I think it's near the bottom of the Q&A. why does the news, and this is the way they've written it, so I'm not saying that you do, but you get a chance to answer this.
Okay.
Why does the news spend so much time spotlighting all the negative, all the violence and crime, but don't spend the same amount of time addressing and highlighting all the positive things going on in our communities, specifically the Central District and South Seattle area? So the context for me, also adding to that is, so you do have the ability to decide what news is, identified and presented to us in 28, 27, 25 minutes, segments. And sometimes it does seem like there's a lot of focus on things that this person identifies as negative. And I wonder, does that influence people's behavior, how they see the world, if they also don't know that there's lots of positive things happening? So how do you balance violence is newsworthy, and also good works, kind works, supportive works is also newsworthy? How does that balance out?
I think that is a really good question. I appreciate somebody asking it. I feel like this is kind of the age-old debate of journalism and of media, because it's something we have been battling and struggling with that conversation, certainly the 20 years that I have been with this company. And so I think, we ask sometimes, like, what is newsworthy? And to answer that question, how does this impact people's lives? And sometimes hard news impacts people's lives more dramatically. One of the things that we did 3 years ago, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Natalie Swaby. She's one of our chief reporters, a very intelligent woman who's been in this market a long time. She and a couple of other people, we redid our public safety policy. We call it our crime policy. And we really dug deep about what are we doing and what do we want to do? Because I don't think we can just not cover it. When it comes to the safety of a person, their family, their business, their community, there's almost nothing more important than safety. How people define that might be different, but how are we covering it? Are we going in with context and solutions? So Natalie, we worked all summer long on some of this, and part of what she said, I'll never forget, is our guiding light is, does it inform and empower the viewer? That is our measuring stick. I'm not saying we're perfect every day. I'm not saying we don't fail sometimes. I think sometimes we do. But I think that is what we continually try to do. And we do, there's a lot we don't cover that you might not see, right? And say, like, why would we cover this story? And what is the value to our community? And sometimes, like, I don't think there's a lot of value here. On the same way that person said there's just so much crime, we also regularly get people saying, why did you not cover this crime in my neighborhood? Was their life not valuable? Why would this person who lost their life not make the news? Because it was in our neighborhood? So ironically, you're kind of a little bit between a rock and a hard place, because if you cover that, then you're kind of creating a negative perception. But if you're not covering it, you're ignoring the value of that life and the impact on that community there. So I think the way that we've tried to answer that is to really empower and inform by centering the voices of those impacted. And those impacted could be, victims' families, it could be nearby businesses, all of those sorts of things. I think it's a really challenging question. I think the other thing is, to try to focus a little bit beyond the immediate thing. Is like, is there a systematic problem here? Is there, if there was a crime on this particular street, Brady Wakayama did a story the other day about a Little Saigon business that it's not one break-in, right? They're dealing with 9 break-ins. And so many of our local businesses have that story. Is it a crime story? Yeah, but it's also a systematic story of the challenges of being a local small business right now in our community. And I think that's an important story. So that hopefully that answered the question.
Mm-hmm. There are a couple questions, comments and questions that are around struggles with COVID in an environment where I think the perception is that we have moved on from COVID. We survived COVID. COVID is now like a seasonal flu. And a couple of people have been asking questions. Shouldn't there be more coverage of the fact that there is long COVID, that there are people who are still physically, emotionally, psychologically, economically impacted by COVID? And do you perceive that there is a need for news media to be more curious and more intentional around the continuing impacts of COVID?
I think that's an absolutely legitimate question and concern. I think that's absolutely legitimate. I think some of what we saw and heard from our audience and community was an exhaustion of it, and they didn't want to hear any more of it. That doesn't mean they didn't need to. And sometimes part of our job as journalists is to give people things they need, even if they don't want it. And I think that's a great question, particularly around the longer term impacts. We do have Christine Pei, she's one of our reporters and anchors, and she does a segment called Health Link that focuses on the Health Link. By the way, we're talking about misinformation primarily around elections, but the number one content that is misinformation is health and well-being. That is where the most misinformation is spread, not around politics. And so that's why we started Health Link, to try to do that. She's done a lot about long COVID. She's done a lot about the vaccines, how they've changed, the impacts, the guidance. She does that regularly, but I understand, like, the problem with our coverage is that, except for me, no one is watching news all day, right? King does 12 and a half hours of news a day. We joke it is a full-time overtime job to watch that. So for that person, it's like, why do you never cover this? Well, maybe they weren't watching at the time we did, which I fully acknowledge. I think that's the hard thing, is how do we make sure that the information gets there when there's so much information? And so Christine does a lot of health news, but if you watch at a particular time or day, maybe you turned it on at quarter after and you missed it, or maybe you didn't watch on that Tuesday she did that. So I think that's great feedback, that maybe we need to revisit COVID and the impacts more often. I think that's a very legitimate critique.
You helped us with another thought, that there is the misinformation, disinformation regarding the elections. Elections are, are underway. And then we'll have ballot tabulations and counting. In early November, there is a swearing in process. In January. So when you're, as news director, when you're thinking about, October through January, you mentioned there's an opportunity to have increased focus on health and well-being. Are there other areas that you're like, from my perspective as news director of King 5, I would want us and others to be more curious and more focused on these other areas, in addition to the elections, in addition to local crime? Are there ones that you want to identify that you were curious about or thinking about that will get more attention?
Yeah, I think our schools are facing a funding crisis that is significant. And we are covering those as they're happening and trying to put them in perspective, right? We all know Seattle Public Schools is closing schools. Shoreline is closing. Many are closing schools. But I think there needs to be a moment where we really think about what is happening here and what is the path forward. Because I got to be honest, closing a couple schools here and there is not going to solve the fundamental problems of funding our schools aligned with the population changes that are here and coming. And I don't see us, and I mean us as media, and I don't see us as a community spending enough time understanding and acknowledging that. And I feel like we keep putting a Band-Aid on it. And our school districts are faced with impossible choices. This is not a critique of them. But when we look at our school budgeting, that is an issue I do not think we cover enough, and I think we should be covering more. I do not think we cover enough the shortage of childcare, particularly in this community. For any working family, the cost of childcare in this community is prohibitive for people working. It is very challenging. And so those are just two examples of things I don't think we cover enough that are like deeply impacting the makeup of our community and the makeup of our workforce. The other thing I think is just continuing to cover what our local workforce and economy, the ebbs and flows of that. That can be challenging because we have a lot of big businesses that don't want to talk about it. And I think that there are some things really happening under the surface in our local economy that is really challenging families to make ends meet. And I don't know that we're covering that as deeply as we can. And I think that's partly because the data when it comes to unemployment and layoffs is a little scattered and sometimes isn't as easy to track. And I also think, the unemployment numbers overall are low, but what about underemployment? What about we all know the cost of living. So I think those are things that really impact people that we should continue to cover.
I really appreciate that. And, for us at United Way, and I've got some United Way folks adding to the chat, childcare, the schools, public schools, that is, cost of living, like, essentials like food, housing costs, those are all areas that are directly impacted by policies a directed impact by elected leaders. And so I think you make a really good point that we could lean in and be more focused on those. And I would suggest to the audience that that's all the more reason for you, if you haven't done it, to take time to study that ballot that should be in your house and look at some of the policy issues that are up for a vote here in our local, regional, and state, and be mindful that we have a governorship, we have city councils, we have school districts. So, and from our perspective, there is a lot of interrelated issues that are at play right now because we have the ability to make some statements about whether keep these policies in place, change the policies, or to elect the next set of elected representative people who represent us and for whom we should be holding them accountable.
And Gordon, I think it's important to this conversation because misinformation distracts us from those important policy conversations. So you mentioned the disinformation that came out of Ohio. I think we all kind of know that story. Think about how much time we spent debunking that, talking about it, covering it, consistently saying, this is not true, this is not true, this is not true. What if we had spent that same energy talking about what are you going to do to fix the cost of living across America that is skyrocketing at an incredible pace? So I think that's also really important, that sometimes these things like are these flashy things that are so distracting and don't let us really dig into the things. I want to vote for someone who is going to represent me on the things that are important to me and my family. And when we are spending that time, we're not asking the right questions and the right policy questions. So I think that is so important.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And to the audience, when we do these conversations for change, we always encourage our audience, our listeners, to put in the chat any takeaways from today's conversations. I think that helps. We are a community of 85 to 90 people right now, and so if you have some takeaways, please put those in the chat for us to think about and for us at United Way to consider, because that may be something we talk about in the future. I will ask the final question and probably just have some reflections in a moment. One of the ones that I think is really important, because we're all living, this is a conversation, but we're living our lives in a time of partisanship, divisiveness, navigating the things we've talked about today. What's real, what's not real, what's an idea versus a fact, what's an opinion versus a judgment. It creates stress and anxiety, and from the political rhetoric to the family dynamics. So I'm going to ask Julie a personal question. What are you doing for mental health and well-being as a human being? And I know that you have a family, close extended family and an immediate family, and as a news director where this is your world. So how are you staying healthy?
I think that's such a great question, Gordon. Sometimes, over the past 5 years where, I was the news director in Louisville when Breonna Taylor was killed by police there, and lots of follow that came from it. We talked a lot about, as a newsroom, I'll answer that question first in the personal, being safe and also feeling safe. And sometimes those are the same things and sometimes they're different things. And so I think for me, both things are important from my King 5 team. Are they safe and are they feeling safe? And I am going in very worried. And I just have to be super honest. I told Gordon this extremely high anxiety going into this election system, this election season. We already have security that we have hired for our crews around Election Day. We used to get through Election Day and that was pretty much it. But now we have these other points in time that we are really worried about. Will there be another January 6th? What are the things we're not thinking of? I recently was in DC talking to some political reporters at all the networks, and they said what worried them is what we're not thinking of, right? And so I think that it is, and then I think to layer that on, violence against journalists is the highest it's ever been in this country. So I think we need to acknowledge that. So the actual physical danger concerns me. I think the mental impact concerns me, because it was not that long ago that the highest office in the land said we were the enemy of the people, and that impacts people, and it influences the public and how they treat their local journalists in their community trying to do their job. So it has increased through the years, and it is definitely spiking now going into election. And election is always a really kind of stressful time in a newsroom. We work crazy hours. We know there's going to be a lot of work. We know it comes with some divisiveness. That's not new. I think what's new is kind of this other layer of physical danger and the lack of trust in the work that you do. I think that can be really undercutting. So I will say one of the things, we have really great mental health services at King. We have free therapy sessions that people use through this thing called Spring Health. I encourage, and I think it's important, I publicly and frequently encourage people to use them, because I think we've been in industry, probably like a lot of your industries, right, that didn't acknowledge that. It's kind of toughen it out, right? If you just tough it through, you can do it. And I think that really publicly saying, like, you've covered a really hard story. This murder story in Falls City is really hard. This election story is really hard, and I think you need to talk to somebody about it. Those are not conversations I ever had coming up in my day, right? And they're really important to have. So I think for the newsroom, trying to continually have their back, make them feel safe, make sure that they are in control of making their decisions about their own safety, I think is really, really important. There is research around secondary trauma, not the original, but secondary, that the closer someone feels that what they do makes a difference, the faster they heal from that. And so I think reminding people what we do matters. In the chat, when you said, what's the number one issue? Many people put democracy. I believe that the First Amendment and the press is an important part of that democracy. And so I think reminding people that helps. For me personally, I think there are kind of two things I do, Gordon. I have to turn it off sometimes. And that is really hard because we're in a 24-hour business. And I think particularly our leadership team, they know, is this worth a phone call or not, right? Sometimes it is. And I get phone calls all hours of the day and night. But I think understanding, like, this is not a middle of the night phone call, this is an email or what this is. And I think really trying to tune it out sometimes, I think that is key, including especially around election, because there's so much coming in. And then I think just like taking care of ourselves as humans is just so key. The lucky thing about being in the PNW is it is a beautiful place to live. Even when it's rainy and even when it gets dark early, I still think it's a beautiful place to live. So getting out and walking, getting out and just doing something that is not related to having your phone or your screen in front of you, I think is really important. And I think kind of prioritizing your health. It sounds funny, like, are you eating regular meals? Are you drinking water? Because sometimes we are working so hard that you go 20 hours, you're like, oh, I haven't had a drink of water. So this is really funny, but these are things we have in the newsroom. Like, have you drinking any water today? That's probably enough caffeine, right? And so those are the kind of, although it sounds silly and simple in these super stressful times, I think, and I would say the same thing for your own your own organizations when you are in those really stressful times, because every business has them, to like take a moment and think about the simple things, because sometimes if you can take care of the simple things, they'll take care of the big things. So it is like eating and drinking and getting your sleep as much as you can. I think that's just key.
And I really appreciate this. I for folks who may have joined after we kicked it off, Julie Wolfe is a member of the United Way Board of Directors. We have basically 41 board members. So I try to make sure our board is very diverse and represents a lot of this community. But you see in Julie's last answer to that very personal question, why we are so appreciative of her as a leader in this community and supporting United Way. What we do is fundamentally about our individual and our shared humanity. And I think that's where I knew she would answer the question the way she did. And it's a message to me and hopefully a message to all of you who are listening to think about that in terms of how you're navigating. You're very curious, and obviously because you tuned in here about media literacy and navigating that, but also it's important that we take care of ourselves. We take care of our family and our friends. And when we do that, we're able then to serve community. And that's what we try to do at United Way. And so I want to thank Julie Wolfe for taking time to be with us, to serve on our board and to help us navigate these challenging times. on the screen. If you've liked what you've heard and you have some curiosity about United Way, there's some ways that you can get involved, and they're on the screen. We have a holiday exchange event, December 7th, helping the community and with seeing themselves being supported and having some nice things as we go into the holiday season. We have an incredible conversation planned with Robin Wall-Kimmerer at the Braiding Sweetgrass, and that's on December 9th. So please take a look at those. We will be doing some more of these conversations of change in the new year. And we're going to end we always have an end of the calendar year appeal. We call it our Neighbor Fund. And fundamentally, it's all about addressing food insecurity, basically hunger, right here in King County, and about our way of addressing the homelessness and housing crisis that continues to affect us, which is helping us with keeping people in their homes through eviction prevention and rental assistance. So if you're looking for a way to get involved, to put a little bit of your precious money into play, I would encourage you to make a gift. I would ask you to make a gift to United Way. Help us with our Neighbor Fund. Help reduce the amount of hunger right here in King County. Help keep our families in the homes in which they currently operate. A house without food is a shelter. Shelter is important, but we aspire for safe and stable homes for all the people in Greater King County. Really appreciate you all being with us. Remember, up until next Tuesday the 5th, there's opportunity and a need for each of you to vote.
Everybody should vote. However you vote is your choice, but have a say.
Yes, please. Take that action. And as Julie mentioned, it is really safe and easy to do. It's mail in. You can drop it in the U.S. Postal Service if you want to pay for it with a stamp, or you can take it to one of the many election boxes that are throughout King County. You just drop it off. No one challenges you. It's done privately, and your voice matters. Your voice matters through this taking the time to vote. Local, regional, state, and national. So here's to United Way. Here's to King 5. Here's to all of you who took the time to be with us. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay active. It's a great community. We're going to work hard to make it even better. Thank you all.
Thank you.